The road to the Lakehouse felt longer than I remembered. Pines lined both sides, their branches bending low like they were bowing to memory itself. I hadn't been there since my father's funeral 5 years ago. When Mark called last week, inviting me to join him and Ethan for a weekend just to catch up, I hesitated. But something in his voice, maybe guilt, maybe loneliness, made me say yes. The Lakehouse wasn't just a building. It was a chapter of my life I'd sealed shut, afraid of what I might feel if I opened it again. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled up. It looked almost exactly the same. Weathered wood, a porch swing creaking in the breeze, and that same old fishing boat tied to the dock. The air smelled like rain and cedar, and for a second I was a kid again, chasing fireflies by the water while my dad laughed with his friends under the porch light. Mark came out first, waving, his face older but still kind. His hair was grayer, his shoulders heavier. "Daniel," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Didn't think you'd really come." Behind him, Ethan appeared, carrying a cooler, his grin wide as ever. "We've got your favorite, barbecue ribs and too much beer," he joked. I smiled, but it felt tight. The warmth between them was familiar, but something about being here made me feel like a ghost, walking through old echoes. Inside, the walls were filled with memories. Photos of fishing trips, summer nights, my dad standing between Mark and Ethan, arms over their shoulders. I stopped at one picture. I was maybe 8 years old, sitting on Mark's shoulders, both of us laughing. The photo felt innocent, but the longer I stared, the more questions it stirred. My dad was behind the camera. His smile in that photo seemed forced. Mark noticed my silence. "That was a good summer," he said quietly. "Your dad loved having you here." I nodded, unsure how to respond. My dad had always been distant, loving in moments but guarded. I never really understood him, especially toward the end. Maybe this trip would give me a chance to. We sat down for dinner, the three of us around the same old table. The air was thick with nostalgia. Ethan told stories, Mark laughed politely, and I mostly listened. Every few minutes I caught Mark looking at me, not in a strange way, but like he wanted to say something and couldn't. When I finally asked about the old boat, Ethan chuckled. "Still floats." "Barely," he said. "Mark's been meaning to fix it for years." Mark shot him a look, half a smile, half something else. "Some things aren't meant to be fixed," he murmured. After dinner, I walked out onto the dock. The water was still, reflecting the faint glow of the cabin lights. I thought about my dad, about how often he brought me here but never let me come alone. Back then I thought it was just about safety. Now, as an adult, I wondered what he was really protecting me from, or hiding me from. The door creaked open behind me. "Can't sleep either?" a voice asked. I turned to see a man about my age stepping out, Mark's son, Jake. I hadn't seen him in over a decade. He looked taller now, broader, but his eyes were the same soft hazel. "Hey," I said, smiling faintly. "Didn't know you'd be here." "Last-minute decision," he said, joining me at the edge of the dock. "Dad thought it'd be good for everyone. You know, clear the air a bit," I frowned. "Clear the air?" He hesitated. "He didn't tell you?" "Tell me what?" I asked, but he just shook his head, looking out over the dark water. "Forget it," he said. "You'll find out soon enough." For a moment we stood in silence, the sound of crickets and soft waves filling the air. The moon hung low, shimmering on the lake's surface like liquid glass. Jake glanced at me, a mix of sympathy and worry in his eyes. "I think my dad's been carrying something for a long time," he said. "Something about your father." The words made my stomach twist. "What do you mean?" I asked, but he didn't answer. Instead, he put his hands in his pockets and walked back toward the house. "Get some rest, Daniel," he said over his shoulder. "Tomorrow might be a long day." I stayed there long after he left, watching the lake breathe under the night sky. The air was heavy, charged, not with fear, but with the weight of something I couldn't name. The wind carried the faint creak of the old porch swing, and for the first time in years, I felt the past reaching out, asking to be heard. Whatever my dad's friends had done, whatever they'd kept from me, I knew I was finally about to find out. Morning came with a low fog that hovered over the lake like a secret refusing to lift. The smell of coffee filled the cabin when I walked into the kitchen. Mark stood by the window, staring out at the water, his cup untouched. "You sleep all right?" he asked without looking at me. "Barely," I admitted. He nodded, almost like he expected that answer. Ethan came in next, clapping me on the shoulder. "We're taking the boat out later," he said cheerfully, trying to lighten the mood. Mark gave him a look, not angry, just weary, and Ethan quieted. Something was definitely brewing beneath their friendly surface. While they prepared breakfast, I drifted toward the boathouse. The door groaned as I opened it. Inside, everything smelled of oil, wet rope, and pine. Dust motes floated in the shafts of sunlight cutting through the slats. I ran my hand over an old wooden workbench and found a small box tucked beneath a tarp. Curiosity got the better of me. I lifted the lid. Inside were photos, letters, and a few keepsakes, things that looked like they belonged to my father. I picked up an envelope addressed to Mark, but it wasn't sealed. The handwriting was familiar, strong, looping, and unmistakably my dad's. My breath caught as I unfolded the letter. "Mark, if you tell him, I'll understand. Just don't let him carry my mistakes. You were always the better man between us. Don't forget that." The paper trembled in my hand. I didn't know what mistakes he meant, but the tone was heavy, regretful, final. I read it twice, maybe 3 times before I heard footsteps behind me. "Daniel?" Mark's voice. I froze. Slowly I turned, the letter still in my hand. His expression drained of color when he saw it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Only the lake outside seemed to move. "Why didn't you ever show me this?" I finally asked. My voice cracked more than I wanted it to. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because I didn't think you were ready to hear what your father wanted me to tell you." "Then tell me now," I said, my chest tight. He leaned against the wall, eyes far away. "Your dad and we were closer than people knew. Closer than friends, maybe too close. It started as loyalty. 2 men trying to make sense of their lives, their marriages, their failures. But somewhere along the way, it became something else. Something we never named, but both felt. The words hit like a wave I didn't see coming. My throat went dry. "I loved him," Mark said quietly. Not in a way the world would have accepted back then. We both pretended it was just friendship. But after he passed, I couldn't face you. You looked too much like him. It felt like seeing the part of him I'd lost. I stood there, caught between disbelief and understanding. I'd always felt something unspoken in the way they looked at each other when I was young, an intensity I couldn't explain. Now it made sense, and yet it made everything more confusing. Ethan's voice cut through the silence. "Mark, stop." He stood in the doorway, his expression sharp. "You don't need to put this on him." Mark shook his head. "He deserves the truth, Ethan. He's lived long enough in the dark." Ethan sighed, muttering something under his breath before walking out. I turned back to Mark. "Was my mother part of this? Did she know?" Mark hesitated. "She knew enough. She loved your father, but I think she always sensed that a part of him was never hers to have. It's why things were hard toward the end. For a long time I didn't say anything. The lake shimmered outside the window, calm and indifferent. Finally I asked, "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because the truth doesn't rot when you bury it," he said softly. "It just waits to be found." The air between us was heavy, thick with things we couldn't change. I looked down at the letter again, then back at him. "You loved him," I repeated quietly. "And you kept that love locked away all these years." Mark nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "He was my best friend, and my greatest regret." I stepped out of the boathouse, needing air, needing distance. The sky had turned gray and rain started to fall, soft at first, then harder. I stood under it, letting it wash over me, trying to breathe. Behind me I heard footsteps. Jake's voice came softly through the rain. "So, he finally told you?" I turned, meeting his eyes. "You knew?" He shrugged. "Not everything. Just that my dad wasn't the same after your father died. He carried something he couldn't talk about." I looked back at the lake, the rain dimpling its surface. "All this time I thought they were just friends." Jake stepped closer, his tone calm but firm. "Love doesn't always fit into the boxes people expect. Sometimes it hides, sometimes it hurts. We stood there in silence, rain falling around us, the Lakehouse behind us breathing with ghosts and memories. The truth was out, but it didn't feel like relief yet. It felt raw, like a wound finally uncovered after years of healing wrong. Jake placed a hand on my shoulder. "Come inside," he said gently. "There's more you need to know." As we walked back toward the house, lightning flickered across the lake. For the first time, I realized that what my father's friends did to me wasn't about betrayal of the body. It was the betrayal of silence. They'd hidden a truth that shaped everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and who my father really was. The storm had passed by morning. Mist clung to the lake, curling over the still water like smoke. Inside, the air was quiet, too quiet. I woke early, the events of the night echoing in my head. The letter, the confession, the rain. Every word Mark said kept replaying, looping between grief and understanding. My father, the man I'd spent my life trying to figure out, suddenly felt both closer and further away than ever. When I stepped outside, Mark was already on the dock, sitting at the edge with a mug of coffee in his hands. He didn't look back when he heard me approach, but his shoulders rose and fell like he was carrying the weight of every unsaid thing left between us. "I didn't sleep," he said after a while. "Me neither," I replied, sitting beside him. The wood was damp beneath us, the air cool and clean. He turned to me, eyes rimmed red. "I never wanted to hurt you, Daniel. I know I failed your father in ways I can't undo, but I swore I'd never fail you too. That's why I stayed away. I thought if I gave you space, I'd be doing the right thing." I stared at the reflection of the clouds moving across the water. "You thought disappearing was the right thing?" He sighed. "Sometimes guilt convinces you that absence is mercy." We sat in silence for a while. The lake rippled with the faint morning breeze, and a single duck crossed the surface, leaving a quiet wake behind. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to shout at him for keeping secrets, for letting me grow up confused about my father's love and who he was. But sitting there, watching this man, older, broken in quiet ways, I couldn't. Instead, I asked, "Did he love you?" Mark hesitated. "Yes, but not in the way that lasts forever. It was a kind of love that lived in stolen moments, in words we never said out loud. And when it ended, we both paid the price." I nodded slowly, feeling something inside me loosen, not forgiveness yet, but understanding. Footsteps approached behind us. Jake stood there, hair messy, eyes still tired. "Coffee?" he asked, holding out a thermos. I accepted it with a quiet "thank you." He looked between us. "You two talked?" "Some," Mark said. Jake crouched beside the dock, skipping a stone across the water. "Dad told me about that letter years ago," he said quietly. "But he said he'd never give it to you until he knew it would heal, not hurt." I looked at him, surprised. "You knew that much?" "Enough to know he's been living in the shadow of it for too long," Jake said. "We all have." Something about his tone, gentle but firm, made me realize this wasn't just my story. It belonged to all of us. Every secret creates ripples that touch everyone nearby. After breakfast, Ethan packed his truck and left early, avoiding eye contact with either of us. I think he wanted the whole thing to disappear. But life doesn't work that way. The truth, once spoken, lingers like smoke after a fire, thin but impossible to ignore. Mark spent most of the day fixing the old boat. I joined him halfway through, handing him tools. Both of us wordless but strangely at peace. As the sun dipped low, we pushed the boat into the water. It wobbled but floated, a little unsteady, like the three of us, trying to move forward after years of silence. Jake joined us at the dock, watching quietly. "Looks like it's got some life left," he said with a grin. Mark smiled faintly. "So do we." Later that evening, as the sun melted behind the trees, we built a small fire by the shore. The air was cool, the kind that makes you pull a blanket tighter but stay anyway because it feels right. Mark stared into the flames, his voice low. "Your dad and I used to sit here and talk about how we'd do things differently when we got older. Be better men, better fathers." Guess we both fell short. I poked at the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise. "Maybe, but you're still here trying. That's what matters." Mark looked up, his eyes soft with gratitude. You're a good man, Daniel. He'd be proud. Something inside me cracked, not in pain, but in release. For years I'd carried questions with no answers, feelings with no place to put them. Now, sitting there between the man who loved my father and the son who reminded me of him, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. When the fire burned low, Jake and I stayed by the water after Mark went inside. The sky was a dark mirror of the lake, stars blinking faintly above. You okay? Jake asked. I nodded. Yeah, I think I am. He smiled, pulling his knees to his chest. It's strange how the truth hurts less than the lies we tell ourselves. Yeah, I said, glancing toward the old cabin. I think I finally understand that. We sat in silence, listening to the water lap against the dock. The Lakehouse no longer felt haunted. It felt alive, filled with ghosts that weren't scary anymore, just real. As I drove away the next morning, I looked back in the rearview mirror one last time. The house stood quietly, golden sunlight touching its roof. I knew I'd never forget what happened here, not because of pain, but because it finally gave meaning to all the things I didn't understand growing up. My father's friends had carried a truth for years, afraid of what it might destroy. But in the end, it didn't destroy anything. It set us free.